Welcome to URP 475, the section on globalization and energy. So why is energy important? And here I list a host of reasons. And of course, at the top of that is economic activity, the main engine of globalization, right? Energy allows us to work beyond daylight hours. That sounds almost sort of a perverse outcome of the electrification of the world. But our economy really now is a 24-hour economy because of the abundant availability of energy or electrical energy. But energy also is important for, or rather, the availability of energy readily, particularly in developing countries. And this is something you may not have thought about, but is very important because it reduces, and here I mentioned this, the opportunity cost of time spent on gathering fuels for energy, such as wood and other materials. And why is this important? Because a lot of this work is done by children and by women, in particular, by girls. And so all the time spent doing that is time not spent participating in the formal labor market. It's time not spent in education. It's basically time that could have been spent on other things that are useful for their lives, but instead it's spent on energy gathering activities and also for water gathering activities. Energy use, no surprise here. Much of the energy on a per capita basis is used in developed countries, rich countries. Canada, U.S. At the top right here. And this is because these countries, developed countries, have industries, have sectors, have a standard of living that is highly energy intensive. And just to basically to appreciate this, look at the amount of energy that you use on a daily basis in your own homes. If you were to compare that to the average person in a developing country, even a average upper middle class person in a developing country, your energy use would be a lot higher. And this is not just the direct energy that you use in your homes, but also the energy that is used to basically give you the goods and services that we have come to take for granted in the developed world, particularly in the US. Why in the US? Because we have some of the highest per capita energy use that is related to the variety, the absolute bewildering variety of goods and services that are available here, right? We have a 24-hour economy. You can pretty much buy anything, anytime, anywhere. And increasingly now, that economy is also available not just, by your car or in person, but it's also available online. A lot of energy is used to make all that packaging that we get that is used to transport the goods that we order online. So this trend is only going to increase as other developing countries move up the income ladder. Okay, a brief primer on sources of energy, renewable and non-renewable. Non-renewable is all the stuff, right? Sort of the bad stuff. Why is it the bad stuff? Well, because it can't be renewed. And oil and coal, natural gas, nuclear. Nuclear is kind of a sort of a weird thing because nuclear energy actually has no direct environmental impact. Well, unless you consider the spent materials. Now, if they're not stored properly, they leak in the environment. There's a profound environmental impact, right? But using coal to produce natural gas, oil, all of these have pretty direct environmental impacts. Renewable energy, the use of renewable energy does what it means is that it can be replenished in a shorter amount of time. So we have wind, geothermal, water, biomass. Biomass is like burning wood. Of course, biomass, some would argue, may also belong maybe on non-renewable side. But anyway, we leave it here for right now. And then solar power as well. Renewable energy, of course, replenished in a short amount of time. So what does the energy use in the United States look like? Well, most of our electricity comes from coal. This may be a surprise to some of you. It's not from other sources. But increasingly, states, and it varies from state to state, are moving towards renewable energy portfolio. And this is mandated by law. California is a leader in this as well. But most of our energy comes from coal. Coal is cheap, but coal also pollutes. Again, coal. Coal is the biggest generator of energy. Okay. How much does the U.S. account for when we look at the world? in terms of our energy use. And again, this should not surprise you. We're about 5% of the population or so, but we use about a fifth of the world's energy resources. So, 5, 22, right? Or 4.6, 21.8. A fifth of the population is using one. I'm sorry, a 20th of the population is using one fifth of the world's resources. So we are using much more than is our fair share. And again, going back to the story that I've been repeating over and over again, globalization causes countries to move up the income ladder, generally speaking. At least overall, the countries move up the income ladder. That does not mean the income is shared equally among the denizens of these countries. Income distribution is also important. But energy consumption goes up across the board because it requires energy to move products from point A to point B. It requires energy to electrify places. It requires energy to produce food, variety of food all year round. It requires energy to process waste. It requires energy to power all the various electrical equipment, right, technology that we use in developed countries. Energy accounts for vast majority, 80% of greenhouse gas emissions. No surprise here again, right? A lot of the environmental impacts that are associated with increasing energy production, right, particularly if you use coal, can be pretty significant. In the next few charts, I go over some basic, units of energy and how you can convert them and figure them out. So I won't cover them here. You can go through them yourself. In the U.S., again, if you break down the energy consumption, on a per capita basis, we use something like 270 kilowatt hours per day per person. And here we look at where the sources of this energy is coming from. Most of it, again, is from petroleum because this has to do with transportation. Earlier, I looked at coal. Coal is mostly about electricity generation and we use electricity in our houses, in industries, and so on. But a lot of the energy, embodied energy in petroleum, is by far the biggest category. And this is 106 kilowatt hours per day per person. Where are all those cars going? Where are all those trucks going, right? Petroleum powers them. Here we look at, again, sources of energy and where they're going, right? Petroleum, vast majority going to transportation. Nuclear, for example, the vast majority going towards electricity generation. Coal, vast majority going towards electricity generation, but some is also going in industrial. Natural gas is sort of split between industrial, residential, electrical power, and then a little bit towards transportation. Here we look at the end use sector shares. So in our homes, residential sector is about a fourth, commercial is about a fifth, industrial is about a third, and then transportation is about a third, a little bit less than a third. So it's pretty evenly split here among these sort of four major sectors in the United States. If you just look at household energy consumption by source, where is it coming from? A lot of it's coming from electricity, which is of course coal, and then some from natural gas for heating, and then others from minor sources right here. A BTU, by the way, here, there was a chart here earlier that looked at a BTU consumption on an annual basis. A BTU is a way of measuring energy, British thermal units, that's what it stands for. Energy consumption per household by different census areas in the U.S. U.S. is 90 million BTUs per household, right, on a per capita basis. So the Midwest and the Northeast uses a lot more per household, right? I should not say exactly per capita because this is per household, but per capita would be per person. But anyway, this is still standardized by household. So households in the Midwest and Northeast use a lot more. And this is primarily because if you look at right here, it has to do with heating, right? Heating. Those in the South and the West use a lot less on a per person basis or per household basis because we have less heating needs. You look at California energy sources and where they come from. This has changed considerably because we have some mandates statewide to transition to a renewable energy portfolio. But we have a lot of energy coming from outside, foreign oil, for example, much less from in-state. Overall, we have a pretty good mix of energy, from local sources as well as outside. But the main thing to sort of see here is that the types of energy that we are getting vary dramatically. So, like, in state, our electricity production, a lot of it's in state, but our natural gas is a lot of it's not from in state, it's from outside. Petroleum production, much fewer of our oil is in state. A lot of it's foreign, and about a fifth of it comes from another state or Alaska. But again, the key take-home point here is that not every state is like California. Again, California, much more progressive environmentally speaking, and that's why we are transitioning into renewable energy because of statewide mandates. If you look at uh, overall consumption and per capita consumption, overall consumption of energy, Texas is the highest. But if you look at per capita consumption, Wyoming is the highest. And this is kind of like water. And this is because the less dense you are, the more per capita consumption you have. Why? Because like water, energy has to travel over much greater distances. Because of that, there's loss, right? There's loss that's associated with transportation of energy over greater distances. If you look at New York, for example, right here, Rhode Island, if you remove Rhode Island, which has a population of like Long Beach, New York is the lowest in the nation on a per capita consumption basis, and this has something to do with density. The same story I was talking about when I was discussing water. Okay, so what does energy look like globally speaking? Well, I mean, the biggest thing is that as countries industrialize, they will mirror the United States. So more and more energy will be required. And this is why, again, China is building all these dams, as well as nuclear power plants and investing in coal, all three. Although, much to China's credit, they're realizing that there's not enough coal to feed or satiate, or even oil to satiate the demand for a growing middle class, an upper middle class. So they are investing heavily in renewable sources like water, and also, I don't want to call it a renewable source, but also nuclear energy. There has been some talk, recently by even environmentalists who are saying that we should look at nuclear energy as a viable option because it is less polluting than the other sources. And of course, there's been backlash against this. But if you're going to have a real conversation about meeting the world's energy needs, which is growing dramatically, we have to certainly consider nuclear in that mix. So energy demand is going to continue to grow throughout the world as the world globalizes and goes up in income. And demand, a lot of this demand is going to be in blue, the developing countries. You notice this right here, OECD, rich countries. Blue, poorer countries. Red is sort of the middle income economies. 1971, a lot of the transition economies, the middle income ones, had a much more sizable chunk. The poor countries, they weren't advanced enough to require more and more energy, and certainly not more energy on a per capita basis. And then what happens as you sort of move up, the years here, you fast forward about 60 years and you look at the biggest chunk of energy demand is going to be sort of split between the rich countries and the poorer countries. Transition countries are going to be much less. A lot of the transition countries, not a lot, but some of them have moved into the rich country arena here. There's quite a bit of disparity here in terms of where there's demand for energy and where that adequate supply exists. So you see that US and Canada increasing demand, but oil production has leveled off. Europe is kind of plateauing off, but production has really fallen off. Not really fallen off, but fallen off. Other rich countries, if you lump them all together, production or need has gone up and it's projected to plateau, and production has already plateaued. And then Mexico is kind of an interesting example. Mexico is an OPEC country, oil producing country. Demand is only going to go up, but their production is going down. So because of this rising demand, what you notice here also is that there's a great deal of trade going on in energy. So you look at oil exports and oil imports here, right? So U.S. importing lots of oil, North America and Canada, U.S. and Canada and North America importing lots of oil, and lots of countries exporting oil, right? Middle East is the biggest chunk right here. And of course, the estimates for whether we've already hit sort of peak oil, they vary, but some experts think that we are already kind of there, that oil production, even though it's, there's capacity for the next few decades, is going to continually level off, that we have to shift towards renewable sources. And that's one of the reasons you see actually, as globalization spreads towards developing countries and developing countries become middle income countries, the transition is happening. Many of these are, as I mentioned earlier, are trying to invest heavily in renewable sources, not just the traditional sources of energy, but also renewable sources of energy. This is true not just of oil, but also of natural gas, right? The export and import of natural gas is also going to go up quite a bit. This trading of energy is unparalleled in human history. Some countries are net exporters, other are net importers, and sometimes, in the case, for example, of North America and then even Japan. Like Japan, you're talking 120 million people, but they import a lot of energy. Why? Because they really don't have natural resources, but they have a very highly productive economy that makes a lot of stuff and exports a lot of finished products. Finished products need energy, right? And not only for their production, but also for transportation within the country of Japan and then for on ships. All of this requires that Japan import energy. Same thing is true of North America. Same thing is true of Europe. But increasingly, in the big two heavyweights here, India and China, are going to account for not just a bigger share of export, but also import as well. They're exporting gas and they're also importing gas as well. It's kind of a paradox. So what are these global trends? Again, just to summarize, energy use is going to go up by quite a bit. A lot of it due to cars and electricity, right? For residential units. And much of this need is going to be in developing countries, and particularly among the sort of the two big heavyweights, China and India. And for some time at least, the Middle East and Russia will become even more important. But of course, if you have an economy based just on natural resources or one natural resources, oil and natural gas, that does not bode well for you in the long term. That's why many of the forward-looking regions in the Middle East, Dubai, for example, are trying to transition out of the UAE, United Arab Emirates, of which Dubai is a part of, is trying to transition out of a over-dependence on oil. Russia, unfortunately, has not made similar investments. It still continues to be heavily natural resource, oil and natural gas dependent, and this is not to the detriment of its economic future. So, what is the recommendation, right? How do we ally globalization with energy and to promote a reliable energy supply? So, this is taken from Deloitte Consulting, this chart, and basically what they're saying is, and then of course you have to contextualize this, from where it's coming from. They are, primarily market-based analyst firm, and so their advice is based on that. So, what do they say? That there has to be free-flowing international trade and investment. So countries have to allow foreign capital to come in, foreign direct investment to come in, and they have to deregulate these markets for energy. And this all has to happen in the context of the rule of law. That means in international peace and cooperation, right? No fighting. No fighting. Producing nations must extract large quantities of energy to meet foreign and domestic demand and develop the internal infrastructure to service growing domestic energy demand. So if you're Saudi Arabia or if you're Mexico or if you're even Russia, oil-producing, natural gas-producing country, you must invest in your infrastructure not only to extract energy, but to transport it both for your domestic needs, but also to export it. That's why, and I have not gotten into this in this class, but if you look at some of the conflicts that are occurring in the context of energy, particularly, the conflicts in the Middle East and Central Asia, right? Some of this can be framed in terms of the desire of the Soviet Union to maintain its ascendancy, its dominance as the energy supplier, natural gas supplier to Europe and other parts of the world. It's kind of sort of a weird thing to sort of consider, energy as a source of war. But if you have a natural resource-based economy, it's imperative that you marshal your resources to maintain that dominant position. This is kind of what Russia is doing. Energy must be available in producing nation and must be transported to consuming nation. Again, I mentioned this, right? And the role that it possibly plays in conflict. And then consuming nations must build and fix infrastructure to service growing domestic energy demand. And this is a pretty big one. In the United States, we've heard much about this right now. We must fix our roads. The Trump administration is talking about investing in infrastructure, and part of this is because transportation costs tend to go up quite a bit if you have poor infrastructure, and infrastructure not just for transportation, but also if you have poor infrastructure for transporting energy directly, like wires, for example, or natural gas pipelines. So all of these things must happen in tandem for a reliable energy supply to meet the growing demands in all sectors of the economy, whether it's industrial, agricultural, residential, and in developing and developed countries. So globalization or not, what should we do? Is globalization going to sort of help this along? Well, again, this really depends on how globalization is allowed to play out. Now, if you look at, again, the perspective of sort of the deregulators, the free market enthusiasts, they see globalization largely as a force for good. If foreign trade and investment is allowed to happen, domestic economic policy allows free flow of trade to happen, and the tariffs, for example, recently slapped on aluminum and steel by the Trump administration is not an example of that. But if domestic economic policy allows free flow of trade and foreign investment and international relations that are relatively sanguine or they are peaceful, then we will have a pretty smooth functioning ship. Globalization will be allowed to operate. On the other hand, there are some real barriers to energy integration. U.S. can go at it alone. We have done this before, and we're kind of hinting at this now. We can have struggles, right? You hear lots of this in the news. Russia is presenting videos on how they have a new class of nuclear weapons. They can bomb anybody. There's a reason for that, because it's important to stay relevant and remind the world that you have the capacity to hurt people, right, through weapons, but also to remind people that, hey, you're a major player. You should be taken seriously. And that you are a major supplier of stuff, primarily energy. You can have resource wars, right? Conflict within states over energy, as well as conflict within nations, right, for energy. And then demographic issues. Japan has this huge problem. Others do too, that have a low birth rate. And I talked about the implications of this in the demography lecture. But basically, if you have dependency ratios that are all out of whack, you have too many people who are dependent, really old people or really young people, or children, and not enough working age people. You have these dependency ratios that don't make sense, that put a lot more strain on the working age to support the elderly in most cases, and this will contribute to instability in many places. All of these things, right, and failed states are an example of this as well. All of these things can contribute to lack of energy integration, which is actually bad for everybody, which is really bad for globalization in the long run. So globalization, if it's allowed to, again, function smoothly, and countries, basically the take-home message here is that countries can do a lot to do this, right? They can deregulate themselves, they can open themselves up, and then they can enforce the rule of law, and then they can cooperate and maintain peace and stability, right? And seek multilateral solutions, meaning many nation-based solutions, as opposed to go at it alone. If they do all of this, we will have much better global energy integration, and you will have cheaper energy. Of course, I want you to remember this. This does not address the sustainability-related issues that arise from energy production, like coal production, right, and so on. In the next section, I look at energy needs specifically among the very, very poor, and we mentioned that energy needs in general are going up throughout the world, but the very, very poor in developing country, the least developed countries, they have quite a bit of need. Why? Because many of these poor are simply not integrated with the existing energy infrastructure. And whatever energy infrastructure exists in these developing countries really exists to serve the middle, upper middle, and upper classes. Many of them are dependent on traditional fuels, and a lot of this work is done by women, gathering wood, for example. So bringing energy to the very, very poor is very, very important. Why? Because you can free up women to do other things, participate in the labor market, you can free up children, give them time to study. And if you give them electricity at night, for example, their economies don't shut down, when nightfall comes. And this is something that we really take for granted in developed countries like the United States. because we have a 24-hour economy. But for many poor in developing countries, that economy simply does not exist. Their world shuts down at nightfall. And so by bringing electricity to them, it can be a very important way of sort of improving their living standard, improving their economic well-being in the long run. And here in this slide, I look at how not only the poor have poor infrastructure, in relation to those who are upper middle class, upper classes, middle class in developing countries, but when they do have access to energy, they often rely on things that are very that pollute a lot, right? Traditional stoves, for example, and they use sources that are sometimes very, very hazardous to their health, right? So this has a energy procurement, energy distribution to the poor has not only sort of an impact on their economic well-being, but it also has an impact on their health. It becomes really a human rights issue. And so in one of the videos, we really talk about this. And this looks at Grameen Shakti, which is a organization, nonprofit in Bangladesh, that has really sought to bring solar power to rural parts of Bangladesh. And what they're doing is they're installing, and others have also copied this model, but what they're doing is installing solar panels, very low-cost solar panels, and allowing the poor to finance it through microcredit. And they're training women primarily to install them. So it's sort of a three-pronged thing, right? They're facilitating the use of microcredit. There are electrifying villages that have no formal energy infrastructure, and they're empowering women to do that. Now, these solar panels can't run washing machines, but they can provide light, right? Which is critical. They can provide power for low energy use appliances. So women don't have to rely on, for example, traditional fuels or spend time procuring traditional fuels, which are both time intensive and can be very, very polluting. And so here I end with basically, the challenge for the coming years, and that is, in addition to providing an infrastructure that allows energy to be exchanged, traded, as well as moved from point A to point B within states and across different nation states, countries, it's also important that we provide energy that is safe, usable to the poorest of the world, and also consider the environment. Here I provide give you some solutions as how this could be accomplished. Of course, this is just a drop in the bucket. Any long-term solution, sustainable solution, will involve undoubtedly governments across the planet adopting the right policies and frameworks for energy production, use, and trade.